Welcome to the Geek Homeworld. I am your host, SavageTechman. We talk sci-fi, TV, movies, superheroes, and all from a geek perspective. You can find us on Blogger, Google+, Twitter, Facebook. We're everywhere. Join the Geek Homeworld. I'm going to attempt to do something you should never do. Rate your top 10 James Bond 007 movies. So grab your tux, grab your Bond girl, grab your gadgety car, and get your vodka martini ready, because we're about to talk Bond. James Bond. Cue the music. That's my terrible Bond theme. Sorry about that, but I couldn't afford the original. We are talking the top 10 Bond films. I'm going to start with the top 10 list, and then I'm going to have an honorable mention section, plus I'm going to have an unhonorable mention. But first and foremost, I'm just going to start right out the gate. I'm not going to include the new movie Spectre in my top 10. Later on, we may come back sometime and say where we are with this list when more Bond movies come out. But Spectre, we got to see Spectre. I loved it. I thought it was very good. Was it as good as Skyfall? That's the big question that everybody's been asking me on Twitter, and I have to say parts of it were, but overall I enjoyed Skyfall better. And I hate to say that. We'll see how it does at the box office regardless, but still a movie worth seeing. It was spectacular. It had some great action sequences. I could have seen more James Bond gadgets. We did get a hint at a few. And by the way, I guess I should have already called spoiler alert on this. If you hadn't watched it yet, then you definitely want to turn away. Or you can skip ahead a little bit, because we're going to go into the list. But Spectre, definitely go see it. You should check it out. It's worth seeing, especially if you're a Bond fan. Now, James Bond has been played by a lot of different characters, from George Lazenby, who did one. You had a couple done by Timothy Dalton. You had Roger Moore, somebody's, or actually everybody's probably favorite. Not necessarily my favorite, but the original James Bond, Sean Connery, is played in a lot of Bond films. We had Roger Moore, Pierce Brosnan, and Daniel Craig. So we had a lot of different men playing Bond, and they were all during different types of movies throughout the decades. So I've got a fondness in my heart for Bond films, because I've always loved the gadgets. I love the cool things about the movies, and so we're going to be talking that. We're going to start with my 10th favorite of the whole Bond series, and this is Tomorrow Never Dies with Pierce Brosnan, who may possibly be, between Roger Moore and Pierce Brosnan, may be my favorite Bond. It's very hard to distinguish which one, because I love different things about their different movies. Tomorrow Never Dies with Pierce Brosnan came out in 1997. It's basically about this media bad guy, and he's starting a war between the UK and China. And it's got a lot of, I believe Terry Hatchert's in this one. I'm not sure. I'd have to double check that. But it was not the most successful Bond movie, but it was good. It was good. Number 9 was Casino Royale with Daniel Craig, his first venture into the James Bond series. And he played, the word that I saw at the time that stuck with me all these years is that he was a more visceral Bond. And we didn't see the gadgets, and we're just finally at Spectre finally seeing some gadgets. But you know, James Bond was known for gadgets, and that was one of the big things that a lot of people complained about, you know. But the Casino Royale was based on an original story. I think it was an unpublished Ian Fleming story on James Bond 007, and Daniel Craig did a superb job. His acting has been superb as James Bond. And he basically, it's about a card game. And it's his first mission as 007. So he's very kind of sloppy in some ways. And I attribute this, if you think about it, Casino Royale, when it came out in 2006, that this was akin to Christopher Nolan with the Dark Knight series when he started with Batman Begins, and you see a Batman Beginning as the title said, and you kind of see that with Daniel Craig as James Bond. So his first foray into playing James Bond 007 was not the smoothest portrayal, but it felt very real. It felt very gritty. It felt very kind of today, I guess you could say. And Casino Royale, I did enjoy it. I will be frank with you here, or actually I'll be Ed, but I can be frank later if you need me to be. Insert laugh. Okay. But most of my list here are the newer Bond films. And there are some older ones. And I guess it's also a perspective of when you grew up and what you got into. It's kind of like Star Trek. Picard is my favorite captain. I grew up with Picard. So, do I like William Shatner? Of course I do. Was he a great captain? Yes. And other people will disagree. It doesn't matter age or whatever. It's the quality. But, I like more of the acting, the Shakespearean background that Patrick Stewart brought to the roles. So that's just one of my preferences, but that's my favorite captain. And that's for another podcast episode. But so we're looking at Daniel Craig in Casino Royale as my 9th favorite. And basically it's 007. He's doing this card game, and he's kind of against a card dealer, and it's a good bond. It's a good Bond. Now, number 8 on my list is Pierce Brosnan's Die Another Day from 2002, which had a cameo by Madonna. And it was basically about this North Korean general, and he had his face redone and all this stuff. And he was an arms arms dealer, but he had this big space weapon. And it's almost akin to another Bond movie you'll hear about later. And I think you know what I'm talking about. If you're really clever, you'll pick up on that. But Die Another Day, 2002, Pierce Brosnan. It was his last foray as Bond, his last time he did the role. And even though it was, it was very gadgety. And honestly, and I don't mean this disrespectfully to Pierce Brosnan's performance, because I thought he might have been my favorite Bond. It's very close between him and Roger Moore as my favorite Bond. But Pierce Brosnan gave such a great performance, and he was believable as Bond. I think he was about the right age for Bond too, if you kind of figure it out. And he was fighting against, the old stereotypes of how women were stereotyped in the earlier Bond movies. And you always had the Bond girls, and he had his Bond girls. Don't think he didn't. But Pierce Brosnan brought an assuredness to the role. He was just very good in the role. But in Die Another Day, Pierce Brosnan's James Bond, and this is what I don't mean the disrespect to. I kind of think of this. I was talking about Batman, the Batman Dark Knight series, but now let's talk about Batman from 1989 all the way to Batman and Robin with George Clooney, which basically almost destroyed the series. And I'm not saying Die Another Day was Batman and Robin, but at that point of Pierce Brosnan's run through James Bond, if you look at it now, some of the gadgety stuff got a little over the top, and it felt a little Batman and Robin-esque. And I guarantee you no one's probably made that comparison before other than me, but I still enjoyed the movie. It was still fun, and a Bond movie is supposed to be fun. It had Halle Berry in it. You couldn't go wrong there. I mean, you had a lot going on in that movie, so Next on the list is actually a little bit older movie from 1973, and I noticed a lot of my excuse me Bond films were in relation to a lot of good Bond themes, and this had a classic one by Paul McCartney, "Live and Let Die." Paul McCartney and Wings, I suppose, from 1973, and basically it was another drug dealer, bad guy, and it had a psychic card reader in it. It was just kind of out there, kind of 70s ish. But Live and Let Die was a good, solid Bond movie. And this one starred Roger Moore. And I did enjoy Roger Moore in that role as 007. He appears on my list at least a few more times, and I grew up with Roger Moore as James Bond. He was the English gentleman. He was very much James Bond. He probably is, if I had to pin it down and say, yes, I have one favorite Bond, I would have to say Roger Moore. Second, I would probably say Pierce Brosnan. Third, I would probably say Daniel Craig. And, we go on from there. So, number 7 on my list, Live and Let Die from 1973. Number 6, and it came from out in 1983, and I remember being kind of young and saying, how can they get away with this title, but Octopussy. And in our politically correct world, I don't know if you could make this movie now, but Roger Moore was once again helming the role of James Bond 007, and Octopussy was about this fake Fabergé egg and jewel smuggling and a nuke attack against NATO. So it was a fun James Bond movie. I enjoyed it. I think there was a circus involved, if I remember correctly, and some of these I've got to really go back and watch and just have a Bond weekend like they do on TV, and just like binge watch all of my Bond movies from Dr. No, the first one with Sean Connery, all the way through the latest one. But at number 6 on my list is Octopussy from 1983. Next, I have an older Bond film from 1965, and it's actually the only one on my list by Sean Connery, I believe. Yes, and it's Thunderball. And I remember it being down in the Bahamas, and it was once again stolen nukes, but a Spectre agent was involved. So I'm not sure if it was Blofeld or not, but it was a very good movie. I enjoyed it, and in saying this list, there are things I can look back at other films that are not on my top 10 Bond list, and I can say, I did like that, or I did like the flying car in this one, or I did like the car that went underwater, or I do like, where it jumped out the plane and crashes the plane, and, you could just go on, and of course, I loved all the cars and the gadgets, and I'm not going to lie, I like the Bond women, who didn't. But I like now that in some of the later James Bond movies now, the women have stronger roles. They're not these sex objects that show up as they were in some of, or the defenseless little women in some of the earlier Bond movies, with a sign of the times. It changed, like when you had Judi Dench later on playing M, I thought was brilliant casting. What a strong, powerful performance that she brings to any role, but especially to the role of M in the Pierce Brosnan James Bonds and into Daniel Craig's James Bond portrayals. So Thunderball, 1965, it was number 5 on my list of favorite Bond films. Number 4, and the song, I remember growing up, I love all kinds of music, and this had one of the greatest Bond theme songs. Now, there are a lot of other ones, like The Spy Who Loved Me with Carly Simon, beautiful song, off of that movie, and I think it was Nobody Does It Better. And there's been other songs from older Bond films that were really good. But from 1981, another Roger Moore Bond film, For Your Eyes Only, and Sheena Easton sang the song. And I attribute a lot of things in life to music, and in different periods of my life I could, decipher when that song came out and what it's related to. But I remember this being a very fun movie, For Your Eyes Only, from 1981, and there was this description and device that they had in there, and there were all these enemies, bad guys running around. It was just a great, fun Bond movie, and there's so much about it. Even the movie posters, if you look at them, some of them were really awesome. Some of the earlier Bond ones were really kind of the time, cheesy, and as you got later, and you could see the different ones. I remember the poster for some of the Bond films. They were very good. But For Your Eyes Only from 1981, Roger Moore being James Bond there, my fourth favorite Bond movie of all time. Now, my third favorite, and this is very high up on the list, and to date, as we speak, we haven't got, the weekend box office results in yet from the new Bond film, Spectre, but this is the previous Bond film. It internationally did over $1 billion. It did more than any Bond film at the box office. But yes, box office isn't everything, I know. And, inflation, ticket prices, blah, 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 all the mechanics that go into that. But Skyfall was a good, solid James Bond movie. Very visceral. That Daniel Craig, very visceral performance once again in his role as 007. And that came out in 2012, which it seems like it hadn't been that long ago, but, time flies. But Skyfall, and beautiful song by Adele, very much a Bond theme in the most classic sense of the word there. And MI6 is attacked in Skyfall, and M, played by Judi Dench, is killed. Spoiler alert, if you hadn't seen it. And if you hadn't seen Skyfall, why haven't you? I really want to know. Daniel Craig did a superb job, and this is probably going to be... He may have one more Bond film in him. He recently came out and said that he did not want to do any more Bond films. He was done with it. And there are some ways, if you see, spoiler alert, the new Bond film, Spectre, it could almost seem like this was his swan song in the foray of playing James Bond 007. And if it was, it wasn't a bad way to go out. But if he's got another Bond film in it, I'm interested. I'm very interested to see. And so on my list, Skyfall comes in number 3 on the list of my top 10 favorite James Bond films. And we're up to number 2. And to watch the number 2 film on my list here is to think about the height of the 80s. And once again, it had a great theme song. But one of the greatest things it had was Christopher Walken as the bad guy. And it had Grace Jones, who was just total kick ass. When we talk about powerful women, she was a Bond girl to an extent, but she was a bad girl, and she was on point with her performance. And this was an aging Roger Moore at this time. So we're talking A View to a Kill from 1985. And I believe that was the last Bond film done by Roger Moore. I still can watch it. I can still enjoy it. It's very much got the 80s cheese factor to it. And you couldn't get any more 80s than Duran Duran, who had the only number 1 James Bond theme with A View to a Kill. And Christopher Walken, I mean, he was basically planning as the villain in this movie to blow up Silicon Valley, and it was this big thing about microchips and everything going on there. And he was in this. There was the Grace Jones bit where Bond's chasing her up the Eiffel Tower, and she is just, and then she just jumps off the Eiffel Tower, and it's so cat and mouse with them, and she's outsmarting him at almost every turn. She's kind of like a 1985 version of Darth Maul. If you think about it, that's how badass Grace Jones was in A View to a Kill. And Christopher Walken, you can't get much more of a bad guy. And I'm trying to think, did they, I think he was into horses, and like there was a horse race involved, and there was a lot going on in The View to a Kill. If you hadn't seen it, it's a good, cheesy 80s movie, but it's Bond at his cheesiest, just about, and it just goes with the sign of the times. So now we come to my number one pick for my all-time favorite Bond movie, and this would not change. This may never change, and for a lot of different reasons. Yes, it did have a pretty good theme by Tina Turner. It was from 1995, GoldenEye, and it was the first James Bond movie done by Pierce Brosnan. And I tell you what, this is my all-time favorite Bond movie, and I can say that with markedly assuredness that this was my favorite Bond movie, because yes, it had the gadgets, but this is the reason I bought a Super Nintendo back in the day, for you gamers out there, was for the original GoldenEye, not GoldenEye Reloaded they tried to do several years ago that just didn't quite work, that had Daniel Craig's face in it, transposed or whatever. Didn't quite work for me. But the original Super Nintendo game system had the GoldenEye game, and the GoldenEye game was the great video game of that system. That was a reason to buy a game system. And the game went just like the movie. So you could almost, if you knew the video game, you knew the movie. If you knew the movie, you knew the video game. So if you got your chance, or you still actually own one of the Super Nintendo GoldenEye games, you've got to play it. The music was spot on Bond. It was everything Bond that I wanted, and it was Pierce Brosnan's first portrayal as James Bond back in 1995. Now, he did 4 Bond movies. Die Another Day, that was his last one I told you about, in 2002. But originally, years before, Pierce Brosnan was going to be, in the early 80s, they were going to make him Bond, but that didn't happen, and he was contractually obligated to a show you may remember from the early 80s, some of you may or may not remember, but called Remington Steele. And it was actually a good show. You can look it up if you need to reference it. But by the time he got to 1995, he was just about, I think, the right age for Bond, and he just had that sarcasm that Bond has, and and Daniel Craig does it too, and Sean Connery does it. All the Bonds, they do it well, but he had that swagger, I guess you'd say, that Bond still has. And Pierce Brosnan's GoldenEye, wonderful. And that was the first time we saw M as Judi Dench, and she was, and this time, there were really, the roles of women in the Bond films were being refined. They weren't just who's the blonde bombshell, or whoever bombshell, who is the Bond girl. Yeah, you had the Bond girls, but even the female characters, they weren't all these helpless people, and I like that they started showing the strength and the power of women in these Bond films. They weren't just objects, I guess is what I'm getting at. So Pierce Brosnan's GoldenEye from 1995, and it was basically dealing with the Russians. There was a nuclear space weapon, and that's what I'm referring back to Die Another Day, how they kind of had that laser. It was kind of like GoldenEye if you think about it. But GoldenEye, and there was also the big surprise, and I'm calling spoiler alert if you had on all this, but especially this part, if you hadn't seen GoldenEye, then turn away, because Sean Bean played 006, James's predecessor in MI6, and he was a double crosser, and he double crossed Bond, and it was very good. And there was just it's just an all-around great Bond movie, and absolutely hands down my favorite James Bond movie, my favorite Super Nintendo game of all time, and all that. GoldenEye, got to check it out. My number one. Now we have some mentions coming up here, and I'm going to start with an unhonorable mention because this next movie may be the worst Bond movie there ever was, but I love space, and I love space shuttles, and it had the big guy with the teeth and all that. But from 1979, Moonraker, and a lot of people did not like Roger Moore's movie, thought this was one of the weakest of the movies, and to watch it now, it probably kind of is, but in some ways it's also classic Bond, and it's Roger Moore. You can't go wrong with Roger Moore as James Bond. You just really can't. And to all you Sean Connery fans that are probably looking at this list and saying, where are more Sean Connery films? I'm sorry, I apologize, but I don't like Goldfinger. I don't think I didn't like George Lazenby and On Her Majesty's Secret Service or Dr. No with Sean Connery. There were other films that I liked. It just these are kind of my favorites, and I still liked Moonraker, even though it was cheesy. I like the fact that it was in space. I love space. I love all that. So that's my unhonorable mention, 1979's Moonraker with Roger Moore. Now, the honorable mentions, Quantum of Solace, the second James Bond movie, and this was Daniel Craig's second James Bond movie, I meant to say. That was the first time from Casino Royale, when it came out in 2006, they followed it with Quantum of Solace, Daniel Craig, and it was a continuation, and with Bond's, lady dying in the movie, and it was just some of the greatest chase scenes ever in a Bond film. It didn't really have much, still didn't have much gadgets, we were, on the level that, if you grew up with James Bond movies, you expected all these outlandish things, the jetpack, the underwater car, everything else, and I could go on and on and on. But Quantum of Solace was just a good, solid action movie. And I once said that The Bourne Ultimatum was the best non-James Bond movie ever. It wasn't officially a Bond movie, but Jason Bourne could be, Matt Damon could be James Bond, and if he showed up as the next James Bond, well, of course there's the whole thing, he's not English, but and there's the other talk, if Daniel Craig moves on now, who's going to replace Daniel Craig as the next Bond? And it's been going back and forth about Idris Elba. I don't see a problem with it. There are a lot of purists out there that say no, James Bond is an English gentleman. He is English this, English that, but you don't necessarily have to be white to be James Bond. That's how he was written. But, these are changing times, and I am, to some extent, I am a purist on some things like this, but the idea of Idris Elba being James Bond, I think he could do it, and I think he would surprise you. I think he'd do it really well. Now, there are a lot of other names that are thrown out there, and probably even younger actors, possibly. Not too young. We don't need a pre-James Bond. But I just want it to be the right feel. And yes, he has to be English. I if they're going to push it too far the other direction, you will alienate some of the major base of 40, 50 plus years of Bond, so you have to be real careful to the source material there, and that spins off into some other things we talked about on previous episodes you might want to talk about, like where we talked about Fantastic Four that didn't do well at the box office and how the casting in there was not necessarily the best thing on that. But anyway, that's a different subject for a different time, and I'll support whoever the new Bond is. So, 'Quantum of Solace is an honorable mention. Diamonds Are Forever, Sean Connery. And I also gave an honorable mention to Timothy Dalton. He did a couple of Bond films, not the most popular ones, but they were okay. And an honorable mention, and the reason that Bond can't be funny anymore, Austin Powers with International Man of Mystery, The Spy Who Shagged Me, and Goldmember. Those Mike Myers movies were hilarious with Dr. Evil and everything else, but they kind of ruined it for Bond. Bond can't be funny anymore. Hopefully next Bond can be funny. So that's my list. I hope you enjoyed it, and please let us know at Geek Homeworld what your favorite Bond films were. And thank you, Q, for supplying all this. All right, goodbye. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Geek Homeworld podcast with your host, SavageTechman. You can find us on Libsyn, Google+, follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, listen to us on iTunes, see us on YouTube, be part of our Mixler chats. Thank you. See you again on the Geek Homeworld podcast.